On the morning of June 18, 1860, Elizabeth Packard woke to the sound of an axe. She heard it before she saw it, the crack of wood splitting, the groan of the frame giving way. And then the window of her bedroom burst inward, and her husband climbed through it. He had not knocked. He had not called out to her first. He had simply waited until the children were downstairs, and then he had come through the window with an axe, because he knew she would not open the door for him. Behind him stood two men she recognized from church. Theophilus introduced them as doctors. He had told them she was insane. They had agreed without examining her. They felt her pulse. They asked her name. They asked the date. They looked at each other and nodded. The certificates had been prepared in advance. They signed them on the windowsill, using the broken frame as a writing surface. The sheriff was waiting in the front hallway downstairs. Elizabeth was 43 years old. She was a mother of 6 children. She had never been charged with a crime. She had never hurt anyone. She had spent the previous 21 years cooking her husband's meals, bearing his children, maintaining his household, and attending his church every Sunday without complaint. She had done one thing, one single thing, that Theophilus Packard could not tolerate. She had disagreed with him, not violently, not publicly, not in a way that brought scandal to their door. She had stood up during a Sunday school lesson and calmly, respectfully, with specific citations from Scripture, challenged his interpretation of a theological point. She had offered her own reading. She had suggested that perhaps he was wrong. He had decided she was insane on the spot. Within an hour of the doctors signing those certificates, Elizabeth was in a carriage headed for the Jacksonville Insane Asylum in Illinois. Her 6 children stood in the doorway of the house and watched her go. The youngest was 2 years old. The eldest was 19. None of them said anything because they did not know what to say, and because their father was standing behind them with his arms folded and his expression closed, and they had all learned by then what it meant when his expression looked like that. Elizabeth did not know, as the carriage pulled away from the house she had kept for 21 years, that she would not see her children again for 3 years. She did not know that while she was locked inside the asylum, her husband would sell her furniture, empty her household accounts, withdraw her children from the schools she had chosen for them, and eventually pack up what remained and move the entire family to Massachusetts. She did not know that when she finally came home, there would be nothing left, not a chair, not a penny, not a single piece of evidence that she had ever lived there at all. The law had permitted all of it, every last piece. Because in 1860, in the state of Illinois, a husband could have his wife committed to an insane asylum with nothing more than his own word and the cooperation of 2 willing physicians. No trial was required, no hearing before a judge, no presentation of evidence, no opportunity for the accused to speak in her own defense. The Illinois Commitment Statute of 1851 had established different procedures for men and women. Men were entitled to due process. Men were entitled to a public jury trial before they could be institutionalized against their will. Men had rights that the law was prepared to defend. Then came the clause for married women. A husband could commit his wife without a public hearing, without her consent, without evidence of insanity beyond his own testimony and the agreement of accommodating doctors. The statute said this explicitly. It was not an interpretation open to debate. It was not a grey area where legal scholars might reasonably disagree. It was written down, ratified by elected legislators, signed by a governor, and enforced by sheriffs across the state of Illinois as a matter of ordinary legal procedure. And Illinois was not alone. Variations of this law existed in nearly every state in the Union, embedded in the centuries-old legal doctrine called coverture, the principle that when a woman married, her legal identity ceased to exist as a separate thing. She became, in the eyes of the law, an extension of her husband, not a person, an appendage, a covered woman. That was the actual legal term, feme covert. A woman covered by her husband's legal identity as if by a coat, whose independent existence had been legally suspended the moment she spoke her wedding vows. Under coverture, a married woman could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not keep her own wages. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not serve as a guardian or executor of an estate. She could not write a will without her husband's consent. She could not, in most states, open a bank account, operate a business, or enter into any binding legal agreement without him. Even the clothes on her back belonged to him. Even the money she had brought to the marriage was now legally his. Even the children she had carried and borne were, by law, his property, not hers, which was why, when Theophilus Packard fled to Massachusetts with the children, no court would compel him to bring them back. The asylum was the perfect weapon within this system because it required so little to deploy and produced such complete results. 2 doctors, 1 signature, an agreeable superintendent. That was all it took to erase a woman from her own life. And once she was inside those walls, the erasure was self-sustaining. If she protested her commitment, her protest was recorded as evidence of agitation. If she demanded to be released, her demands were interpreted as delusion. If she remained calm and rational, her calm was described as the dangerous quiet of a mind that had retreated too far inward to be reached. The medical profession of the era provided the vocabulary that made this circular logic sound respectable. Physicians built entire diagnostic frameworks around the premise that female independence was a symptom of disease. A woman who challenged her husband's authority was displaying pathological defiance. A woman who read too much was overtaxing her delicate nervous system and risking the permanent damage of her reproductive organs. A woman who managed her own finances, or who had the audacity to wish she could, was exhibiting what one journal called masculine protest syndrome, an actual diagnosis published in actual peer-reviewed medical journals that classified financial independence in women as a psychiatric condition requiring treatment. The logic was circular, and it had been designed to be. A sane woman naturally and willingly deferred to her husband. Therefore, any woman who refused to defer to her husband was, by definition, not fully sane. Therefore, her refusal to accept commitment was simply further confirmation of the condition that justified committing her. There was no exit from the argument. The argument had been engineered to have no exit. You could not prove your sanity by protesting your commitment, because protesting your commitment was proof of insanity. You could not prove it by being calm, because being unusually calm in a situation like this was also, depending on the attending physician's mood, potentially a symptom. You could not appeal to the law because the law was the mechanism being used against you. Inside the Jacksonville asylum, Elizabeth Packard did something that her husband had not anticipated and that the doctors and administrators around her were not prepared for. She wrote, "Every day, in whatever scraps of time the institution's routine allowed her," she wrote. She filled notebooks with meticulous observations about the other patients, about the conditions inside the ward, about the legal mechanisms that had deposited her there, about the circular reasoning used to keep women locked inside, regardless of their actual mental state. She wrote about her fellow patients with the specificity of a reporter. One woman had been committed for reading novels, which her husband considered an unnatural activity for a wife and mother. Another had been institutionalized for what her commitment papers described as hard study. She had been pursuing education in a subject her husband found unsuitable for a woman, and her pursuit of it had been taken as evidence of disordered thinking. A third had been committed for what was recorded as insane behavior during the change of life. She had been menstruating, and her husband found her irritable during that time, and a doctor had agreed that the irritability exceeded what was natural. She had been inside for 8 years. More than 200 patients were crowded into a facility built for 140. The waiting list for admission was 240 people long. The wards were overflowing, not because there was a sudden epidemic of genuine mental illness in Illinois, but because the commitment laws made it trivially easy to deposit inconvenient people, and by people in practice, the law meant women, inside these walls and leave them there indefinitely. Elizabeth smuggled her notebooks out. She hid them in the bindings of books she returned to visitors. She passed them through servants she had won over with patience and the force of her obvious intelligence. The notebooks travelled out of the asylum and into the world, and documented everything she had witnessed with a precision that made them impossible to dismiss as the ravings of a disturbed mind. She was released in 1863, not because any official had concluded she had been wrongly committed, not because the asylum superintendent had reviewed her case and found no evidence of mental illness. She was released because 3 years had passed and she had learned to be sufficiently compliant, sufficiently quiet, sufficiently careful not to do anything that could be recorded as defiance in front of witnesses. She had learned to perform the version of herself that the institution required. She walked out of that building after 3 years with her notebooks intact and her mind intact and her fury intact and her marriage technically still in place. Theophilus, who had by this point moved the family to Massachusetts, allowed her to return to the family home in Illinois. Then, the day after she arrived, he locked her in the bedroom. He nailed the windows shut from the outside. He removed the interior door handle so she could not open the door from inside. He planned to have her committed again at the earliest legal opportunity, and in the meantime, he intended to keep her contained within the walls of the house until that opportunity arose. A neighbour noticed. Neighbours had a habit of noticing things in small towns, and the particular sight of a woman who had just returned home after 3 years in an asylum, being confined to a locked bedroom by her husband, was the kind of thing that generated conversation at the general store and in the church pews. A local lawyer heard the conversation. He filed a writ of habeas corpus on Elizabeth's behalf. A hearing was scheduled, and because the courthouse was far away and the matter was considered local, the judge ordered that the hearing be conducted in the living room of the Packard family home. The jury was made up of neighbours. 12 men who had known Elizabeth Packard and Theophilus Packard for years, who had seen them at church and at community gatherings, who had formed opinions about both of them over the course of 2 decades. The trial lasted 5 days. Physicians who had participated in her original commitment testified that her religious views and her refusal to submit to her husband's theological authority demonstrated genuine insanity. Neighbours and friends testified on her behalf. One doctor and theologian testified that the specific religious ideas Elizabeth held, the ones that Theophilus had used as evidence of her mental deterioration, were shared by large numbers of respectable European intellectuals, and were in no way outside the mainstream of contemporary theological discussion. The jury deliberated for 7 minutes. They returned a verdict of sane. Theophilus Packard left Illinois that same night. He took the children and moved back to Massachusetts and refused to correspond with Elizabeth about where exactly they were or what their circumstances were. Elizabeth was left with a house she could not legally sell because it was in her husband's name, accounts she could not access because they were in her husband's name, and a marriage she could not end because in 1864 in Illinois, the grounds for divorce did not include having been wrongly committed to an insane asylum by your husband for 3 years. She had won the battle, but winning the battle had left her with nothing. So she did the only thing she could think of to do with nothing. She decided to make sure it could not happen to anyone else the same way. She took her notebooks and she went to the Illinois state legislature and she asked to speak to them. They let her speak, probably because they expected the spectacle of a recently released asylum patient presenting her case to be entertaining in a minor way and harmless in every way. Because what could she actually do? She was a woman with no money, no legal standing, no husband, no institutional backing, and no one powerful on her side. She was also the most precise, most organised, most thoroughly documented advocate they had ever encountered on the subject of commitment law reform. She walked into the Illinois legislature in 1867, and she walked out having secured the passage of a personal liberty law that required a public jury trial before any person, including a married woman, could be committed to an insane asylum against their will. Not a certificate signed by two cooperative doctors and a superintendent. A public trial, a jury of peers, the right to present evidence, the right to have witnesses testify on your behalf, the right to contest the accusation before it destroyed your life. Illinois was one state. She went to 12 more. She wrote books that documented her experience and the experiences of the women she had met inside the asylum. She gave speeches that drew crowds because her story was equal parts outrage and fascination, and the audience always left feeling slightly sick about what the law had permitted, and slightly awed that she was still standing. She lobbied in person, state legislature by state legislature, with the patience and precision of someone who had learned inside an asylum that the only thing between her and complete erasure was the written word. By the 1880s, she had reformed commitment laws in 4 states and secured the passage of a married women's property protection law in Illinois. In Iowa, a law passed largely because of her advocacy made it illegal for asylum officials to intercept patients' mail. A reform that seems small until you understand that intercepting mail was the primary mechanism by which institutions kept patients from communicating with anyone outside who might advocate for their release. In 1869, 6 years after Theophilus had fled with the children, a court awarded her custody of her 3 youngest. She supported them and her reform campaigns with the proceeds from her published books and speaking fees. She never stopped. Her nationwide lobbying efforts continued through the 1880s, more than 2 decades after the axe went through the window. She was in her 70s before she finally slowed down, and even then she was working. What she had accomplished was extraordinary, and it was entirely the result of a woman with no money, no institutional power, and no legal standing taking the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turning it into a lever. But here is the thing that has to be said about Elizabeth Packard's story before we go any further. Elizabeth Packard was not wealthy. Her husband was a minister of modest means. The weapon deployed against her was not primarily about money. It was about control, about theology, about the intolerable spectacle of a woman who thought her opinion mattered as much as her husband's. The cases that came after her, the ones that filled the last decades of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, were often different in a specific and instructive way. Because as the Gilded Age built its extraordinary fortunes and deposited some of those fortunes through inheritance and widowhood and the occasional legal novelty into the hands of women, the asylum weapon became something else. Something more precise. Something aimed not at opinion or theology, but at a target that was considerably larger and considerably more worth the effort. It became a mechanism for stealing money. To understand how wealth transformed the asylum weapon, you first have to understand what it meant to inherit money in Gilded Age America, and specifically what it meant for a woman to inherit it. By 1870, the United States had produced its first generation of truly industrial fortunes. The railroads, the steel mills, the oil fields, the shipping empires. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie had built wealth so enormous it had no precedent in American history, no template against which it could be measured. In a country where the average working man earned approximately $500 a year, these fortunes reached into the hundreds of millions. They were not just large, they were incomprehensible. They were so far beyond ordinary human experience that they had to be understood as a different category of thing entirely. Not money in the way a working family understood money, not savings or wages or the contents of a strongbox under the bed, but power in its most concentrated and portable form. These men died and left their money somewhere, to wives, to children, to institutions, and sometimes, more often than the era's mythology suggests, the money went to women who had no male intermediary between themselves and the fortune. unmarried daughters who were the sole surviving heir, widows whose husbands had died without sons to inherit, women whose fathers had structured their wills in unconventional ways for unconventional reasons. The law by this point had nominally improved. The Married Women's Property Acts, passed state by state beginning in 1839, had theoretically granted married women the right to own property in their own names. By 1870, most states had some version of this law on the books. The worst features of coverture, the complete absorption of a wife's legal identity into her husband's, the automatic transfer of all her property to him upon marriage, had been, in theory, reformed. In theory. In practice, the law on paper and the law as lived experience were two different things, separated by the vast distance between what legislators had written down and what courts were willing to enforce, what husbands were willing to accept, and what machinery remained available to those who wanted to challenge a woman's control of her own money. The Married Women's Property Acts created rights. They did not create the enforcement mechanisms that would make those rights real. And they did nothing whatsoever, about the commitment laws that allowed a woman to be removed from her own life, on the word of a husband and a cooperative physician. So the weapon adapted. It became more targeted and more financially motivated. And the women who found themselves in its crosshairs in the last decades of the 19th century were, more often than not, women who had done exactly one thing wrong. They had inherited too much. Harriet Robinson was born in November of 1834 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, into the kind of wealth that smelled like whale oil and salt water. Her family had built the largest whaling fleet in New Bedford, which in the mid-19th century was the largest whaling city in America, which meant her family's money was rooted in one of the dominant industries of the pre-industrial era. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, was one of the most successful businessmen in New England, and because his only son had died young, leaving Harriet as his sole surviving child, he made a decision unusual for the era. He decided she should understand the business. From the time she was 6 years old, Harriet read the financial papers to her grandfather Gideon, whose eyesight was failing. She heard his commentary on the markets, absorbed his analysis, began to form her own opinions about what the numbers meant and what they predicted. By the time she was 13, she was doing the household accounts. By the time she was a young woman, she understood compound interest and asset valuation, and the mechanics of distressed asset acquisition, with a fluency that most men who worked on Wall Street did not possess. She was also apparently impossible to manage. She had opinions. She expressed them. She had a mind that operated faster than the people around her, and she did not have the patience to pretend otherwise. She was sent to a Quaker boarding school that was meant to instill humility and thrift and the virtues of plainness. And what it actually instilled was a rock-solid conviction that she could get by on very little, and therefore had no need to perform the elaborate social rituals that wealthy young women were expected to perform. She wore plain clothes, not because she was unaware of fashion, but because she found fashion wasteful. She ate simply not because she could not afford otherwise, but because simple food was sufficient, and sufficient was all she required. She was also, by all accounts, attractive and charming when she chose to be, and her father sent her to stay with a cousin in New York in the hopes of finding her a suitable match. He gave her $1,200 for the purpose of making an impression. She deposited 1,000 of it in the bank and used the remaining 200 for everything else. She had a fine time at the balls and parties, and she failed entirely to make the match her father had in mind. She eventually married Edward Henry Green, a Vermont businessman who had made his own fortune in Asia and who was 12 years her senior and financially comfortable enough that she could not accuse him of fortune hunting. She made one demand before she agreed to the marriage, a demand so unusual for 1865 that it generated considerable discussion in the families involved. She asked Edward to sign a document renouncing all legal claim to her money. Not a portion of it, all of it. Her inheritance would remain hers, legally and practically, after the wedding as before it. Edward agreed. Her father, who was dying and worried about what would become of his fortune without a male heir to manage it, agreed to encourage the marriage on the condition that the inheritance be legally protected from Edward's control. The protection was formalised in her father's will, which specified that the estate was to be kept free from the debts, control, or interference of any husband. Then her father died, and her Aunt Sylvia, who was also enormously wealthy and had no children of her own, died shortly after. And Harriet Robinson Green, she had taken her husband's name, found herself, in the spring of 1865, in possession of a fortune estimated at between $5 and $7 million, and the knowledge that every man in her orbit was going to spend the next several decades trying to get it away from her. She was right. The first challenge came from the executors of her Aunt Sylvia's estate, who disputed the terms of the will on the grounds that Hetty, she was known to everyone as Hetty, had allegedly produced a forged codicil claiming a larger share of the inheritance. The legal case became notorious, in part because it was one of the earliest applications of forensic mathematics to a legal dispute. Experts analysed the handwriting and signature on the disputed document using mathematical probability. The court ruled against Hetty. She settled for a smaller portion of the estate and spent the next year or so genuinely afraid that her legal situation might deteriorate into something criminal. She was never charged with anything. But the experience taught her something she never forgot. The legal system was not a neutral mechanism that would enforce her rights fairly and consistently. It was an arena in which the people with more resources and more social legitimacy usually won, and she needed to be prepared to fight every battle with everything she had, because no one was going to fight them for her. She and Edward moved to London temporarily, partly because the atmosphere in American financial and legal circles was uncomfortable, and partly because Edward, despite his own considerable fortune, had a weakness for speculation that Hetty found alarming and that she wanted to put some distance between herself and. They had 2 children, Edward Jr. and Sylvia, in London. Then they came back to America, and Hetty began the work of building her fortune. What she built over the next 50 years was one of the most impressive investment records in the history of American finance. She bought real estate and held it. She bought government bonds and held them. She bought railroad stocks when everyone was selling them in panic and sold them when everyone was buying in euphoria. She lent money at fair rates to institutions and individuals that conventional banks considered too risky. And she was almost always paid back because she was careful about whom she lent to, and because the borrowers knew that Hetty Green would pursue a debt to the ends of the earth before she would write it off. When her husband's business collapsed in 1885, because Edward had borrowed against the assumption that Hetty would cover his debts, and Hetty refused to cover his debts, she let him go bankrupt, rather than compromise the financial independence she had spent 20 years constructing. They separated but never divorced. He died in 1902. By that point, Hetty's fortune was estimated at $60 million. It would reach $100 million before she died in 1916, making her, by virtually any measure, the most successful investor of her generation. Not the most successful woman investor. The most successful investor, period, in an era that included J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. The newspapers called her the Witch of Wall Street. The name appeared in print for the first time around 1895, after Hetty began wearing Black Widow's mourning clothes that she never fully gave up. She was in mourning for her husband's decline, or perhaps simply committed to the Quaker plainness she had never abandoned. Or perhaps she had discovered that a woman in black was noticed less, and therefore left alone more, which in her experience was almost always preferable to being noticed. The nickname stuck because it gave people a vocabulary for something they found deeply unsettling, which was a woman who was better at making money than they were. The stories accumulated alongside the nickname, each one designed to explain her success in terms that did not require acknowledging her intelligence. She was a miser. She was eccentric. She had possibly lost her mind at some point, and what people took for financial genius was actually a species of obsession, no different in kind from a man who hoarded string or saved every newspaper. She wore the same dress for years at a stretch. She heated her oatmeal on the radiator at the bank where she worked because she was too cheap to pay for a proper office and too stubborn to go without oatmeal. She moved from boarding house to boarding house in Hoboken and Brooklyn and various other locations to avoid establishing a legal residence in New York City, which would have subjected her to city taxes. This was framed as evidence of mental instability rather than as evidence of exactly the kind of precise, disciplined thinking that had made her wealthy in the first place. The worst story, the one that became most famous and most damaging, involved her son Ned's leg. Ned had injured his knee at some point in his childhood, and the story, as it circulated in newspapers and gossip columns, held that Hetty had disguised herself and her son as poor people and taken him to a charity hospital to avoid paying for private medical care, and that the knee had not been properly treated, and that this negligence had eventually led to the amputation of the leg. She had supposedly crippled her own child through miserliness. Historians who have examined the actual record find the story considerably more complicated. Ned did eventually lose the leg. The cause and timing of the amputation and its relationship to any particular treatment decision is less clear than the legend suggests. What is clear is that Hetty Green was by all accounts a devoted mother who spent significant time and energy on her children's well-being, and that a story about a mother sacrificing her son's leg to save a few dollars in medical bills was exactly the kind of story that a society deeply uncomfortable with a woman's financial power would find satisfying. It reduced her. It made her eccentric rather than brilliant. It made her monstrous rather than threatening. A monster can be contained. A brilliant investor with $100 million and a lifetime of successful legal battles behind her is considerably harder to put in a box. The challenges to her fortune came in waves across her entire adult life. Her husband's creditors had tried to claim her personal assets to cover his debts. She had fought them and won. Her aunt's executors had tried to contest the will. She had settled but protected the bulk of her inheritance. Various business partners and debtors over the years had attempted legal maneuvers designed to redirect some portion of her wealth into their own hands. She had fought every one of them with a ferocity that made the legal cost of attacking her higher than most challengers were willing to pay. What never materialized, despite the conditions that might have encouraged it, was a formal legal attempt to have her declared incompetent. There were discussions. There were conversations in drawing rooms and lawyers' offices about whether her eccentricities and the boarding houses, the radiator oatmeal, the refusal to spend money on an office, the black dress, the constant moving, might constitute evidence of mental impairment sufficient to support a competency challenge. The discussions never produced action, and they never produced action for a simple reason: she would have destroyed anyone who tried it. Hetty Green kept lawyers on retainer for 50 years. She had sued and won against some of the most powerful institutions in the country. She had forced a settlement on her aunt's estate against a team of experienced lawyers backed by the estate's full resources. She had legally separated her finances from her husband's in an era when that separation was almost unprecedented, and then successfully defended that separation in court when his creditors came knocking. She knew every relevant statute. She had opinions about every judge in New York. She was, in the language of her own era, a woman of business. And no one who dealt with her in any financial or legal capacity ever made the mistake of underestimating her a second time. The newspapers had called her insane in everything but the formal legal sense for decades. They had built a public portrait of a woman so eccentric, so obsessive, so clearly disordered that a jury of ordinary citizens might well have concluded she lacked the mental capacity to manage her own affairs. But a jury never got the chance, because the people who might have assembled that jury looked at Hetty Green's record of 50 years of successful litigation and decided that the cost of losing to her was too high. She died in her own bed in 1916, at the age of 81, with her fortune intact and her independence intact, and her name known in every financial house in New York and Chicago and Boston. Her son, Ned, inherited the fortune and spent it with spectacular enthusiasm over the next few decades. He bought everything his mother had refused to buy, travelled everywhere she had refused to travel, lived exactly the extravagant life she had denied herself, and died having greatly diminished what she had spent 80 years building. The Guinness Book of World Records, at some point in the middle of the 20th century, named Hetty Green the world's greatest miser. Not the world's greatest female investor. Not one of the most successful financiers in American history. The world's greatest miser. The record stood for years. She would have sued them for it, and she would have won. The asylum weapon that Theophilus Packard had used so casually against his wife in 1860 was, by the 1880s and 1890s, a somewhat more expensive proposition than it had once been. Elizabeth Packard's reforms had closed the most egregious legal loopholes. Several states now required jury trials before commitment. The newspapers had begun, following Packard's lead, to take an interest in cases of wrongful institutionalization. The social machinery that made it easy to lock a woman away and leave her there was not dismantled. It never fully was. But it had developed friction. Using it required more effort and more cover and more willingness to endure scrutiny, which meant that the people who still used it tended to have a particularly compelling reason. Nellie Bly was 23 years old in the fall of 1887, and she was about to discover exactly what that machinery looked like from the inside. She was not wealthy, she was not an heiress. She was a reporter, one of a tiny number of female journalists working in New York City, employed by Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, a paper that specialized in exactly the kind of sensationalistic investigative story that her editor, Colonel John Cockerill, had in mind when he called her into his office one September afternoon and proposed an assignment that most reporters would have declined immediately. The Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island, a small island in the East River now known as Roosevelt Island, was the subject of persistent rumors. Former patients and their families had been talking for years about conditions inside the facility that went beyond the ordinary grimness of institutional life. Rumors of abuse, of neglect, of patients who were not mentally ill at all but had been committed through the same mechanisms Elizabeth Packard had documented. A cooperative physician, a willing family member, a legal process that provided almost no protection to the person being committed. Cockerill wanted someone to go inside and find out whether the rumours were true. He proposed that Bly get herself committed. She accepted without hesitation. The preparation was meticulous. She took a room at a boarding house called the Temporary Home for Females on 2nd Avenue and spent 2 days practicing the behaviour she would need to perform, the distant expression, the confusion in her eyes, the refusal to engage normally with the world around her. She rehearsed it in her mirror until it felt like something she could sustain under pressure. She had been warned that medical examiners were experienced at detecting people who were pretending to be disturbed, but she had a theory about this, which was that the examiners were also deeply motivated to find people disturbed rather than sane, because finding people sane created paperwork and complications, while finding people disturbed cleared their desks of responsibility. She was right. Within 2 days of arriving at the boarding house, the other residents had summoned the police out of concern about her behaviour. A perplexed judge sent her to Bellevue Hospital for observation. 4 doctors examined her there. All 4 concluded she was insane. The examination, as she later described it, consisted mainly of a brief physical check, looking at her tongue, taking her pulse, and a handful of questions focused primarily on whether she was a kept woman, meaning whether she had a man who could take responsibility for her. She did not, and her confusion about where she was and who she was — she had told the boarding house that her name was Nellie Brown — was sufficient evidence of mental impairment to satisfy all 4 physicians. They sent her to Blackwell's Island. She spent 10 days inside the Women's Lunatic Asylum. She went in with a plan and an editor who had promised to get her out, but even knowing she would be released, Even knowing that her stay had a defined end point, the experience unsettled her in ways she had not anticipated. The moment she crossed the threshold of the asylum, she stopped pretending to be disturbed. She behaved, she later wrote, exactly as she would have behaved in normal life. She talked with the staff normally. She reasoned with them normally. She made perfectly coherent observations about the conditions around her. The more sanely she behaved, the more disturbed she was considered to be. She described the conditions with the precision that made her reporting famous. The building had been constructed to hold 1,000 patients. It was holding 1,600. Budget cuts had reduced the medical staff to 16 doctors for 1,600 patients. The food was gruel and spoiled beef and bread that had dried to something resembling wood and water that was undrinkable. The dangerous patients were bound together with ropes and made to sit on hard benches for hours without moving. The cold was constant. There was inadequate heating for the space, and the patients sat in it and shivered and were not given additional clothing. The baths, she wrote, was something she returned to in memory with specific dread. The bathwater was cold. Ice cold, she said. 3 buckets of it poured over her head while she sat shaking, her teeth chattering, her skin going blue. The bathwater was not changed between patients. The same water, growing progressively more opaque, was used on one woman after another. The towels were shared. She dried herself with a towel that had been used by a woman with open sores and did not protest because protesting would have been recorded as evidence of agitation. And she had learned within hours that evidence of agitation was the fastest way to make your situation significantly worse. She spoke with every patient who would speak with her. She became convinced, as she talked to woman after woman, that many of them were not mentally ill at all. She could not prove this. She was not a doctor, and she understood that some conditions that were invisible to a casual observer might be diagnosed by a trained clinician. But she could document what she saw. She could record the stories the women told her about how they had arrived. One had been committed by her husband after a marital dispute. Several were recent immigrants who spoke little or no English and had been unable to communicate with the doctors who examined them. Doctors who had taken their inability to communicate in English as evidence of mental impairment. Some had been committed because they were poor, because they had no one to advocate for them, because they had fallen through the gaps of a society that had no other mechanism for handling women who were inconvenient or incomprehensible, or simply in the wrong place without the right papers. The insane asylum on Blackwell's Island, she wrote after she was released, is a human rat trap. It is easy to get in, but once there, it is impossible to get out. The New York World published her account in October 1887 as a 2-part series. It became one of the most widely read and widely discussed news stories of the year. A grand jury launched an investigation into conditions at the asylum. The city's budget appropriation for the Department of Public Charities and Corrections was increased by nearly $1 million. $50,000 was specifically designated for improvements at Blackwell's Island. 7 years later, the asylum closed entirely. Nellie Bly had done what investigative journalism at its best can do. She had gone inside a closed system, documented what was happening there, and made it impossible for the people responsible to pretend they had not known. The reforms that followed were real, and they were significant. But the reforms were not complete. They could not be, because the fundamental problem was not the conditions inside one particular institution. The fundamental problem was the mechanism that put people inside institutions in the first place. The legal and social architecture that made it easy to remove a woman from her own life on the basis of someone else's word, and hold her there with minimal legal recourse. That architecture did not collapse because Nellie Bly wrote 2 articles. It bent. It became more uncomfortable to use openly, but it remained. And in the drawing rooms and law offices of Gilded Age society, it remained available to anyone who had a compelling enough reason to reach for it. Annie Fields was not a woman you would expect to find in an asylum. She was the widow of James T. Fields, the Boston publisher who had been one of the most culturally significant figures of his era. His literary salon had hosted Nathaniel Hawthorne and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Oliver Wendell Holmes. And after his death in 1881, Annie had continued hosting, building on the institutional prestige her husband had established and expanding it in directions that reflected her own considerable intelligence and literary judgment. She had inherited his publishing estate, the house on Charles Street in Boston, and approximately $80,000, modest by Gilded age standards, but enough to live comfortably and to maintain the salon that gave her life its structure and purpose. She had also, since 1874, shared her home and her life with Sarah Orne Jewett, the writer from South Berwick, Maine, who would become one of the most celebrated American regional authors of the 19th century. They had met at a literary gathering in 1869, when Sarah was 20 and Annie was 35, and the connection had been immediate and literary and emotional, and had deepened over the following years into something that encompassed all of those things and exceeded them. By 1874, Sarah had moved into the Charles Street house, and they had been living together for 10 years by the time the trouble began. Their relationship was what the era called a Boston marriage. Two women sharing a household, sharing finances, sharing a life, in an arrangement that mimicked marriage in its domestic intimacy and its assumption of permanence without any of the legal recognition that marriage would have provided. The term was used descriptively, without the moral weight that would have attached to more explicit language. Polite Boston society knew what it meant. Polite Boston society also knew that demanding more explicit language would require making accusations that nobody was quite prepared to make in public, partly out of genuine uncertainty and partly out of the knowledge that the women in Boston marriages tended to be precisely the kind of women you did not want as enemies. Annie Fields's enemies, however, were not deterred by either uncertainty or prudence. Her cousins, the blood relatives who had expected to inherit after James T. Fields's death, and who had been watching for 15 years as Annie built legal structures designed to prevent exactly that, had a plan. They had watched her redirect her inherited income into charitable trusts and literary foundations and legal mechanisms that kept the money moving away from family and toward the institutions and people she valued. They had watched her establish a life estate for Sarah Orne Jewett that would guarantee Sarah the right to live in the house and benefit from the estate's income after Annie's death. They had watched every move she made with her money, and they had reached a conclusion. The money was going to disappear before they could get to it, unless they acted first. They arrived on a Tuesday evening in 1891. Two physicians, a document signed by a judge. The physicians had not examined Annie before signing. They had taken the cousin's description of her behaviour and produced a certificate that used the word monomania, a diagnosis from the era's psychiatric vocabulary, meaning an obsessive fixation on a single subject to the exclusion of rational thought. The subject of Annie's supposed monomania was not named in the certificate. It did not need to be. Everyone in the room understood what it was: her money and what she was doing with it. The lead cousin explained to Annie, in the tone of a man performing a kindness, that she had been behaving erratically, that her financial decisions showed evidence of impaired judgment, that her living arrangements were of a character that raised questions about her mental stability, that for her own protection they were taking her to McLean Hospital in Belmont for evaluation and observation. If the physicians there found her competent, she would of course be released immediately. If they found her impaired, and they used the passive construction carefully, as if the finding would be the hospital's independent conclusion rather than the predetermined result of a scheme they had been assembling for months, then a conservator would be appointed to manage her affairs. A conservator appointed by the court, on the recommendation of the cousins, who would then have effective control over every financial decision Annie Fields made until the day she died. Annie understood what she was looking at. She had spent 15 years building legal defences precisely because she had understood that something like this was possible. She asked to see the commitment papers. She read them carefully, then she asked to use the bathroom. Instead, she went to her study. She had approximately 20 minutes. She wrote 3 letters. The first was to Sarah, who was in Maine visiting her family, explaining what was happening and directing her to contact their lawyer, George Hale, without delay. The second was to Hale himself, invoking habeas corpus and describing the circumstances of her removal. The third was to the editor of the Boston Evening Transcript, a man who had been attending her literary salon for years and who owed her, in the informal social accounting of Boston intellectual life, a considerable debt of loyalty. She described the events of the evening in specific detail. She named the cousins. She named the physicians. She described the commitment papers and the diagnosis they contained, and her assessment of the financial motivation behind the entire proceeding. She gave all 3 letters to her housekeeper, Catherine, who had worked for her for 15 years. She told Catherine to wait 1 hour after Annie left, then deliver the letters personally to each recipient. If anyone tried to prevent her from making the deliveries, she was to call for the police. Then Annie went back to the parlour and told her cousin she was ready. She was taken to McLean Hospital that night and processed as a patient. Her jewellery was removed, her clothes were searched. She was given an institutional garment and shown to a room with bars on the windows and a door that locked from the outside. She spent 3 days inside that room. During those 3 days, she organised her thoughts, rehearsed her case, and remained as calm and precise as she had ever been in her life. Calm and precision were, under the circumstances, both the correct emotional response and the most devastating possible defence. A woman who spoke coherently about property law and the structure of charitable trusts was difficult to describe as monomaniacal. Catherine delivered the letters. By the next morning, George Hale had filed a writ of habeas corpus. By noon, the Boston Evening Transcript had published Annie's letter on the front page. The headline read, "Heiress imprisoned by family seeking fortune." The scandal was immediate and total. McLean Hospital, which depended on its reputation for discretion and good judgment as the institution to which Boston's most prominent families sent their troubled relatives, was suddenly the subject of public outrage about how it could have accepted a commitment based on certificates signed by physicians who had never examined the patient. The cousins, who had expected a quiet family matter, resolved behind closed doors, found themselves named in newspapers and accused of conspiracy to defraud a wealthy relative. The hearing was held 3 days later. Annie appeared in court in the clothes Sarah had brought her, accompanied by George Hale. She answered every question the judge asked with an exactness that the courtroom found impressive. She recited poetry from memory when the judge asked her to demonstrate recall. She described the legal structure of her charitable trusts and literary foundations in enough detail that the judge's expression shifted noticeably from skeptical to interested. She explained her household finances as fluently as a trained accountant. When the judge asked the 2 physicians to explain and justify their diagnosis of monomania, they spoke about moral irregularity and unnatural domestic arrangements and attachments that exceeded the bounds of normal friendship. The judge asked them directly whether moral irregularity constituted a medical diagnosis. They admitted, under that specific pressure, that it did not. The commitment was voided. Annie was released. The judge issued a written ruling that would become a significant precedent. Commitment required actual medical examination and evidence of specific mental impairment, not family disapproval of lifestyle choices or financial decisions. The cousins were ordered to pay the court costs. The 2 physicians were censured by the Massachusetts Medical Board for signing commitment certificates without examining the patient. Annie went home to Charles Street and locked the door. The legal victory was complete. Everything that could be won had been won. The cousins had been exposed, embarrassed, and ordered to pay costs. The physicians had been professionally censured. The precedent had been set. Annie's estate planning, the legal structures she had spent 15 years building, remained intact. But she was never entirely free of the experience. The fear of that night, being taken from her own home by people who had already decided her fate before they knocked on the door, being stripped of her jewellery and her clothes and her freedom by a legal system that had required only a signature and a diagnosis, never fully left her. It changed the texture of how she lived. She became more careful with every document she produced, more thorough in the witnesses she engaged for every legal transaction, more vigilant about the people she allowed close to her financial affairs. The defences she rebuilt in the years after 1891 were more extensive than the ones the cousins had attempted to breach, not because there was new danger, but because she had learned that danger could come from directions she had not anticipated, and the cost of being caught unprepared was too high. She spent the remaining decades of her life in the house on Charles Street with Sarah Orne Jewett, who died in 1909. Annie survived her by 6 years, dying in 1915. Her will held, the life estate held, the literary foundations held. The cousins received nothing beyond what Annie had always intended them to receive, which was nothing. Her obituary in the Boston papers described her as the devoted companion of Sarah Orne Jewett and the widow of the publisher James T. Fields. It described her charitable work with warmth and her salon with admiration. It did not mention the Tuesday evening in 1891 when she had written 3 letters in 20 minutes and then walked out of her own home under escort, because everything depended on whether her housekeeper could get those letters delivered before the cousins realised what was happening. The erasure was respectful in the way that erasure usually is. It kept the parts that were comfortable and removed the parts that were not, and called the result a tribute. The stories of Elizabeth Packard, Hetty Green and Annie Fields are not isolated incidents. They are 3 points on a line that runs through the entire second half of the 19th century and into the early decades of the 20th, a line described by the intersection of 2 forces. The first force was the explosion of wealth in Gilded Age America and the unprecedented concentration of that wealth in the hands of women, through inheritance, through widowhood, through the legal reforms that had theoretically granted married women the right to keep their own property. The second force was the persistence of a legal and social architecture that had been built on the assumption that women were not fit to control large sums of money, and that had never been fully dismantled, and that remained available as a weapon to anyone sufficiently motivated and sufficiently unscrupulous to reach for it. Where those 2 forces intersected, you found the asylum, and the competency hearing, and the newspaper campaign, and the medical diagnosis, hysteria, monomania, masculine protest syndrome, whatever vocabulary the era had most recently endorsed as a respectable way to describe a woman whose financial independence was inconvenient to the men around her. The diagnosis changed across the decades. The mechanism remained the same. Consider the other women whose names appear in the records of this era, women who were not Elizabeth Packard, who had a husband's targeted malice to contend with, or Hetty Green, who had a lifetime of legal preparation behind her, or Annie Fields, who had both the resources and the presence of mind to write 3 letters in 20 minutes and give them to a loyal housekeeper. Consider the women who had less preparation, fewer resources, fewer allies, less luck. The admission records of the major psychiatric institutions of the Gilded Age period show women committed for suppressed menstruation, for religious excitement, for reading novels, for the change of life, for what one record describes simply as an attack caused by the loss of property. A woman whose assets had been seized by her husband, who had been so distressed by the loss that her distress itself was recorded as evidence of the mental incapacity that had supposedly justified the seizure in the first place. Another record, a woman committed for overexertion. She had been working too hard, and working too hard was taken as evidence that she had lost the ability to govern herself according to the natural rhythms that properly ordered feminine life was supposed to follow. These were not fringe cases. These were the ordinary workings of a system that had been built to process women who deviated from expected behaviour, and deviation from expected behaviour in the Gilded Age covered an enormous range of conduct, much of it having to do with money. A woman who was too interested in her own financial affairs, a woman who made investment decisions without consulting her male relatives, a woman who refused to surrender an inheritance to a husband or a son. A woman who was, in the plainest possible terms, too rich and too unwilling to hand that richness over. The system had mechanics, and it had vocabulary, and it had the full endorsement of the medical establishment, which had spent several decades constructing a scientific framework around the idea that female independence was a psychiatric condition. Doctors published papers. Journals printed them. Courts cited them. The papers said that a woman who sought financial independence was displaying pathological symptoms of gender inversion. She was behaving in a masculine way, which was by definition disordered, because women's natural psychology was oriented toward domesticity and dependence, and any deviation from that orientation indicated that something had gone wrong with the mechanism. This was not fringe thinking. This was the mainstream medical view. The psychiatrists who signed commitment certificates in cases like Annie Fields's were not acting outside the bounds of their professional training. They were doing exactly what their training told them to do, identifying a woman who was behaving in ways inconsistent with healthy femininity and recommending that she be placed in an environment where her behavior could be corrected. The fact that the behavior they were pathologizing was the behavior of a woman who had spent 15 years carefully and legally managing her own financial affairs was not visible to them as a contradiction. It was, in their framework, precisely the problem. Nellie Bly's investigation had triggered reforms. Elizabeth Packard's lobbying had produced legislation. Annie Fields's court case had produced precedent. And the women's property rights movement that had been building since the 1840s had, by the 1890s, established on paper a substantial body of law protecting women's right to own and control property independently of their husbands. But the gap between law on paper and law in practice is always wider than reformers' hope and narrower than opponents' fear. The commitment laws had become more difficult to deploy casually, but they had not been eliminated. The medical vocabulary used to justify commitment had become more sophisticated, but no less circular. And the financial incentives that made attacking a wealthy woman's competency worthwhile had grown along with the fortunes themselves. What changed in the early decades of the 20th century was not the desire to deploy the weapon, it was the cost. The combination of legal precedents, journalistic scrutiny, and the growing sophistication of women's own legal defences made casual use increasingly risky and increasingly expensive. The Annie Fields case, with its front-page newspaper story and its medical board censure and its court costs assessed against the plaintiffs, had demonstrated that attempting to have a prominent woman committed on dubious grounds could produce consequences more damaging than the fortune was worth. The weapon adapted again. The outright asylum commitment gave way to the civil competency proceeding, the lawsuit filed by family members claiming a relative was mentally unfit to manage her own finances. These were harder to win. They required more evidence. They offered more procedural protections. But they were also harder to fight because they could be sustained indefinitely through legal manoeuvring, and the legal fees alone were enough to consume a significant portion of a fortune while the case dragged through the courts. The underlying logic never changed. A woman who controlled her own money was a problem that required a solution. And the solution, always, across every decade and every legal reform and every journalistic expose, was to challenge not the money, but her mind. Because challenging the money directly required proving wrongdoing. Challenging her sanity required only suspicion, a willing physician, and the inertia of a legal system that had been built at its foundation on the premise that a woman's independent judgment was presumptively unreliable. The last thing to be said about these women is the thing that their obituaries left out and their institutions erased and their families found most inconvenient to remember. They won. Elizabeth Packard went into an asylum with nothing and came out with her notebooks and her rage intact, and spent 30 years using both to dismantle the legal structure that had put her there. Hetty Green inherited a fortune and spent 50 years fighting every challenge to it with a precision and ferocity that made attacking her too expensive to attempt. Annie Fields wrote 3 letters in 20 minutes and got herself out of an asylum before the cousins understood what had happened. They won by being more prepared, more precise, more legally sophisticated, and more willing to fight publicly and loudly than the people who came for their money had anticipated. They won by understanding that the only defense against a weapon that operated through silence and closed doors was noise. The right letter delivered to the right editor at the right time, the right legal precedent established in the right courtroom, the right words published in the right newspaper before the door closed and the locks went on. They won at extraordinary cost. Hetty Green paid for her victory with 50 years of isolation, of boarding houses and radiator oatmeal, and a life stripped to its financial essentials, because she had decided somewhere in her 30s that the only truly safe thing she owned was her ability to make money, and she would not risk it on the ordinary human pleasures that wealth was supposed to provide. Elizabeth Packard paid with 3 years inside a locked ward, and 6 years of her children's childhoods, and a marriage that was both legal and catastrophic, and that she could not end because the law would not let her. Annie Fields paid with the knowledge, lodged permanently in her mind after 1891, that the life she had built could be taken in a single evening by people with access to a cooperative physician and a judge's signature. The price they paid is the part that the newspapers got wrong, that the obituaries missed, that the institutions they founded preferred not to discuss. The narrative that the era wanted to tell about these women was either the monster narrative, the witch, the miser, the madwoman, or the triumph narrative, the reformer, the philanthropist, the beloved hostess. Both narratives erased the cost. Both narratives made the victory look easier than it was, made the women look either villainous or saintly, and avoided the more difficult truth. The more difficult truth was that surviving in Gilded Age America as a woman who controlled significant wealth required a particular and exhausting kind of vigilance. It required knowing the law better than the people who were using it against you. It required anticipating attacks before they arrived. It required building defences that were more expensive to breach than the prize was worth. It required being willing to fight publicly when every social instinct of your class and era told you that public fighting was undignified, and that undignified women forfeited their claim to sympathy. It required understanding at the deepest possible level that the asylum was not a hospital. It was a tool. And the tool would be used on you, not because you were unwell, but because you owned too much and refused to give it up. They understood this. They fought accordingly, and the world they fought in was considerably improved for the women who came after them, largely because those women never knew what had been cleared from the road before they walked it. The Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island closed in 1895, 7 years after Nellie Bly walked out of it. The island was eventually renamed Roosevelt Island. The asylum building was partially demolished. The portion that remains stands today as a stabilized ruin at the island's southern tip, preserved as an official New York City landmark. Its stone walls still marking the outline of the rooms where 1,600 women were housed, where 1,000 had been meant to live. A monument to Nellie Bly was installed nearby in 2021. It honours her courage and her reporting, and her role in the reforms that followed her investigation. It does not mention the women who were still inside when she left, the ones for whom no editor was coming with a promise of release, the ones who sat on hard benches in the cold and waited for a relative who was never going to come. the Jacksonville Insane Asylum, where Elizabeth Packard was held for 3 years while her husband sold her furniture and emptied her accounts and disappeared with her children, was demolished in 1912. No plaque marks the site. The location is occupied by a state agency of a different kind. Elizabeth Packard is buried in a Chicago cemetery. Her headstone gives her name and dates. It does not mention the 30 years she spent, after walking out of that asylum, making sure that no other woman would be carried through a broken window in the same way she had been. Hetty Green is buried in Bellows Falls, Vermont. Her son spent the bulk of the fortune she had spent 50 years building within a few decades of her death. The Guinness Book of World Records eventually retired the category of world's greatest miser. Warren Buffett, who built a fortune using many of the same value investing principles that Hetty had pioneered 60 years earlier, is celebrated as one of the greatest investors in history. His name is known to virtually every person who follows financial news. Hetty Green's name is known to historians and to people who happen to come across old newspaper clippings about the Witch of Wall Street. Annie Fields' house on Charles Street in Boston still stands. It is a private residence now. The literary salon that had operated there for 4 decades is a footnote in academic histories of New England literature. Annie herself is remembered, when she is remembered at all, primarily in relation to her famous husband and her famous friend. The Tuesday evening in 1891, when her cousins came through the door with commitment papers and she wrote 3 letters in 20 minutes, does not appear in most accounts of her life. These are small omissions in large lives, but they are not accidental omissions. They are the residue of the same impulse that had put the women inside those walls in the first place. The instinct to contain them, to reduce them, to make them comprehensible by making them smaller than they actually were. The monster and the saint are both small enough to fit into a paragraph. The complicated truth of a woman who fought a legal war for 30 years, or 50 years, or for one night in a study with 3 letters and a housekeeper, does not fit easily into a paragraph. Which is perhaps why the complicated truth is the one that keeps getting lost. The question that their stories leave behind is not really about the past. It is about what we decide to remember and why, and what we lose when we remember the comfortable version instead of the true one. The safe version of these women's lives, the witch, the philanthropist, the hostess, asks nothing of us. It closes neatly and allows us to move on. The true version does not close. It sits in the space between what the law permitted and what women did to survive it, between the certificates the physicians signed and the letters that got delivered just in time, between the asset that walked out the door in a carriage headed for Jacksonville and the legislator who sat in an Illinois hearing room 30 years later and voted to require a jury trial. The true version asks a question that has no comfortable answer. It asks, what kind of vigilance does it require to keep what is yours, in a world that has decided at its foundations that it should not be yours at all? The women in these stories knew the answer to that question. They knew it the way you know something that costs you everything to learn. And if you walk past the ruins of the asylum on Roosevelt Island today, or past the parking structure that stands where the Jacksonville Insane Asylum once stood, or past any of the buildings that bear the names of the institutions these women funded, or the foundations they established, or the legal precedents they fought to create, if you stop and stand there for a moment and think about what it actually cost, the answer comes to you with a clarity that has nothing to do with the 19th century at all. Everything. It cost them everything. And they paid it anyway.